Hi, folks. So I'm going to be doing my presentation on the concept of sexuality and in connection to nature in 19th century British and American literature. For this, I will be discussing Ian Forster's Morris and also Henry David Thoreau's The Woodcutter. In the title, you see it says Queering Freedom with Nature. And so for most of the presentation, I'll also be queering the concept of freedom. And, and this will be done through the queer characters and how they discover freedom within nature. So I hope you enjoy. There's a strong connection between the ways authors like E.M. Forster and Henry David Thoreau were portraying queer sexuality in connection to nature. This strong weaving of sex and nature was meant to lead readers into recognizing how queer sexuality, sexual desire, and gender are natural and most closely related to nature, whereas commodification of constructed gender roles and sexuality are unnatural. These authors demonstrated that queer characters, when placed in situations within their own nature, are most happy and free. Thoreau's The Woodchopper and Forster's Morris, although quite differently express themselves, both explore the characterized queer freedom in a similar manner that straight characters have often been privileged in experiencing. This queer freedom is represented in contradiction to society and is instead produced within the natural world. More specifically, for these two authors, within the vast obscure woods. The author's choice to align queer sexuality to nature is to demonstrate the naturalness such desires obtain and the vastness their freedom to be within their own nature in exploring such love with others and themselves. So before I dive into analyzing the text further, I thought it'd be important to elaborate and possibly define a bit more the concept of queer and queer theory. And Christopher Luby, from the introduction of Cecil Dream, wrote this excellent description. I love it. He wrote, queer is a term in use today to suggest a broad range of erotic tastes, inclinations, attachments, and desires that do not fall neatly into the binary categories the dominant cultures still frequently deploy for the sake of distinguishing between the normal, heterosexual, and the abnormal, homosexual. So it's important to understand that queer texts are quite complex because authors had to veil these private relations and associations of characters with ambiguous and sometimes muddy prose to remove the scrutiny of public eye. And that is why it's important to approach such writings with a delicate amount of attention. Queer text and theory are fascinating because, well, from several reasons, but they're most fascinating for me because they apply so beautifully to eco-criticism. Eco-critic Jeffrey Weeks wrote, sexuality in general and homosexuality in particular has been shaped in a complex and ever-changing history over the past 100 years. At the center of that history has been the making of sexual identities. Identities we so readily take for granted now as rooted in nature, but which in fact have variety of determinable sources and points of origin. So in short, Weeks is demonstrating how humans have fallen for this myth that our identity is this natural occurrence, when in fact society has shaped these concepts and ideologies of naturalness in relation to sexuality for hundreds of years. And unfortunately, we believe this myth. In Forster's Morris, the protagonist was a cultivated young gentleman. Morris was raised in a well-to-do family, provided a fine education, and later worked at a bank. He had been molded by the hands of society to become the kind of man, quote, to love a noble woman, to protect and serve her. This was the crown of life. However, for Morris, this was quite unnatural. He didn't want that life. Later, Morris falls in love with Alec, a young man who, quote, lived in open air, end quote. This too was something unfamiliar and queer to Morris. Open air? Freedom? He was a man of society, a society that was restraining and containing, that forced its people into conforming. That is exactly what Morris's boyhood friend did, Clive Durham, when he had married Anne Woods. No, Morris believed, quote, there was something better in life than this rubbish. If only he could get it. Love, nobility, big spaces, where passion clasped peace, spaces no science could reach. But they existed forever full of woods, some of them, and arched with majestic skies, and a friend. The woods would be Morris's escape from the constraints and surveillance society. As Morris had mentioned to his doctor, quote, England wasn't all built over and policed. Men of his sort could take to the greenwood, end quote. Morris loved Alec, but young Alec was below Morris's social class, and even Alec considered himself, quote, rather rough. It's in some men's nature, end quote. And he also wrote Morris stating, quote, it is natural to want a girl. You cannot go against nature, end quote. But that is exactly what Morris planned to do, because it was not natural for him to want a girl. Morris, quote, was an outlaw in disguise. Perhaps among those who took to the greenwood in old time, there had been two men like himself, too, end quote. And finally, accepting Alec as his natural lover, Morris was free from the restraints of society. On the other side of the pond, some years before Morris, Thoreau abandoned American society and escaped to a cabin in the woods. Sure, there has been speculations to Thoreau's sexuality. Gay, straight, neither, both. However, it was never clear, and it's still not clear. And that alone is quite queer, the unknowing and questioning of it all. These similar hums and haws were further expressed by critics when analyzing his writing on the woodchopper. Thoreau's prose are far more implicit than Forster had explored in Morris, but there are several similarities as well. Thoreau explored within the shaded and majestic pine trees freedom, and Thoreau's woodchopper was emblematic of such freedom. According to Thoreau, the Canadian woodchopper was a true, quote, Homeric and Paphlagonian man, end quote. And as we have discussed in previous classes, this allusion to Greek mythology suggests male desires. The freedom the woodchopper embodied differed from Thoreau's own concept of freedom. Thoreau wrote, he interested me because he was so quiet and solitary and so happy withal, a well of good humor and contentment. The woodchopper aligns with Morris's Alec, since both men are of, quote, the open air and seemingly less domesticated and cultivated. As Thoreau describes the young woodchopper, quote, in him, the animal man chiefly was developed. In physical endurance and contentment, he was cousin to the pine and rock, end quote. This description demonstrates how the woodchopper is so far escaped and free from society that he more resembles the pine and the rock than Thoreau himself. Thoreau further describes the young man, claiming, when nature made him, she gave him a strong body and contentment for his portion. Here again, the word contentment is used. Clearly, the woodchopper is satisfied and comfortable with his solidarity. However, Thoreau just can't shake away the fact the woodchopper was not a learned man. And this, too, is something that Morris grapples with. Are these men of open air just a bit too free? Their willingness to dislocate from the constructed norms of society comes so natural to them that it frightens and possibly threatens the cultured man, like Thoreau and Morris. Alec and the woodchopper were, quote, so simple and naturally humble, end quote, within their own nature.